In Islam Under Siege, Akbar Ahmed considers the challenges facing Muslims in the aftermath of the events of September 11th. He spoke about it recently for an hour.
Thank you, Barbara. It's great to be home again. Home, I say, because Politics and Prose was the first great institution that invited me when I arrived in Washington almost 2 years ago. And Barbara has been a great friend, and this great institution has always welcomed me. So Barbara, thank you. Cleve, thank you. And all the great people working here, thank you very much. As a fellow author 2 centuries ago, across the pond put it, for Muslims, this is the best of times and the worst of times. The best of times for Muslims, because we're having functions like this. I don't think if September 11 had not happened, someone like me may not have even been invited to a distinguished institution like this. So we do have a platform, we do have a possibility of dialogue, interaction, possibility of mutual understanding. In that sense, it is opening up all kinds of doors. On another level, we know that people in the administration, led by President Bush himself, have taken the lead. President Bush has visited the Islamic Center, the mosques. He has met Muslim leaders, and he really has reached out in interfaith dialogue. But he is one man. The crisis we are heading for cannot be overcome by one man, and it cannot be partisan, and it cannot be communal. We all need to be involved in this interfaith initiative that has begun after September. On another level, the first Abraham Summit was launched last October by my friend Rabbi Bruce Lustig at the Washington Hebrew Congregation, and supported strongly by Bishop John Chain, and since then it has picked up momentum. So once again, something new has happened and taken place right here in Washington. Small steps, but significant steps. So the best of times. At the same time, for Muslims, these are also the worst of times. And let me share some of this with you. The Prophet of Islam has been attacked and abused in public over the last 1 to 2 years. He has been called a terrorist. He has been called all kinds of names. I want to convey to you that for Muslims, the Prophet is a central figure within Islam. Muslims love him and revere him. They don't consider him divine. It's not quite what Christians think of Jesus, who is divine for them. For Muslims, the Prophet is not divine, but he is a man who commands immense respect and love and affection. And in turn, Muslims respect and love the great figures in the Bible. They respect and love Moses. They respect Jesus. We respect Jesus so much that I could not call Jesus Isa, which is the equivalent of Jesus in our language. I would say Isa alayhi salam, which means Jesus, peace be upon him, because of the respect I have for Jesus. So if someone attacks the Prophet, a Muslim cannot in turn attack Jesus. So Muslims are puzzled, they are mystified, and very often they are hurt. And when they are hurt, they get angry. And when they are angry, their emotions are out of control. So the Prophet is attacked, the Quran is attacked, God is attacked, Islam is attacked. It is a wicked and evil religion, people say. Worst of times. A few days ago, 2 young Muslim students were shot. Now in this atmosphere, why were they shot? Muslims are uneasy. A few days before that, a Sikh was shot in Arizona. Why was a Sikh shot? Because he had a beard and a turban. And for a lot of people, a man with a beard and a turban must be a Muslim. So the Sikh was shot. And perhaps the most chilling of all, and we were just discussing this before the function this evening, a cross was burnt at an Islamic center in Prince George's County. Now, I'm an anthropologist. I understand what the burning cross means in American society. I understand where it's coming from. I understand where the target was. And I also understand it means hatred in any society. So if it is the African American today, it is also Jewish, it is also Catholic, and today it's the turn of the Muslims. And I implore you, you great and distinguished Americans sitting in front of me, to preserve this great society. Because what you achieved in the 1960s and 70s, you fought for your civil rights movements. You gave sacrifices, Kennedy, Martin Luther Jr. King, and so on. There were so many people who were actually sacrificed on the altar, who gave their lives for this struggle. With this burning cross, we are telling them that the clock has reverted back. A small thing, not a huge event, but for me as an anthropologist, a most significant and even symbolic happening, which should alert us all. So, the best of times, tremendous opportunities and possibilities opening up in front of us. The worst of times, tension, crisis, hatred, intolerance, and both jostling, both fighting, both struggling. Not surprising, the Pew institution had polls recently, a survey, and their findings were that Americans increasingly look on Islam as a religion of violence, and they don't like Islam very much. And not surprisingly, recent polls in the Middle East and the Muslim world confirmed that Americans have never been more unpopular and more disliked than in the last couple of years. So once again, the danger signs of societies moving apart, of a chasm growing between these societies. And here we have the reality of the world politics in front of us today, where American soldiers are in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and to some extent in countries like Pakistan, where one soldier on average is still dying in Iraq, where there is an uncertain long-term presence, and we are not sure how that will end, where the need for understanding, the need for mutual understanding, for interfaith dialogue is never more urgent than today. After September 11, there were so many questions that were thrown up, and relevant questions about Islam. Does Islam preach democracy, or is it incompatible with democracy? Does Islam preach the hatred of Jews and Christians, as Osama bin Laden would like us to believe? Does Islam subjugate women? These were basic questions, and they were asked throughout America. They were asked from the length and breadth of America. I believe after almost 2 years, we are now moving into another phase of the relationship between America and the Muslims. This is a more complex phase, a more involved phase, a more complicated phase, and a more dangerous phase. And the questions have to be more sophisticated. The answers have to be more sophisticated. We cannot have simplistic questions and simplistic answers. I'm constantly appalled not only at the simplistic questions, but the simplistic answers. I switch on my television set and I see 4 so-called experts sitting around the table discussing my religion, my culture, and my history. And I ask myself, would there be 4 non-African Americans discussing African American history? Or 4 non-Jewish people discussing the Jewish history? And the answer is no. And yet today you will have constantly people telling us about Muslim culture, Muslim. So what we are really seeing is an internal dialogue taking place. And what the Muslim world is thinking or feeling, or the anger or the violence or the sense of turmoil in the Muslim world is really being missed. So the signs are being misread. And that dialogue, which needs to be taking place, is not fully taking place. That is why I call my book Islam Under Siege. Islam Under Siege. Because Islam as a religion feels under siege. And I've given you some examples why this is the case. The cover has a young man calling people to prayer. And behind him, there's a minaret blown up by some shells, and there's fire behind the minaret. It's an apocalyptic picture, a very powerful picture for a Muslim or for any person of faith, because a mosque, like a synagogue, like a church, is a house of God. And when the house of God is blown up, it affects us. It saddens us, it angers us, and it makes us feel that we are under siege. Now, what is remarkable in our time is that not only Muslims feel under siege. If you recall, the news after September 11 was broadcast on American television under the title, America Under Siege. If you talk to Israelis, they will say, we are under siege. We are surrounded by the Arabs who want to wipe us off the face of this earth. If you talk to Indians, they will say, we are surrounded by Pakistan on one side and Bangladesh on the other side. We are under siege. If you talk to Muslims, they will say, we are being killed in Palestine, in the Balkans, in Chechnya, in Kashmir. We are under siege. So it is a dangerous, a complicated time. And Muslims are feeling a sense of under siege at a time when global societies themselves are feeling under siege for all kinds of reasons which are linked with what we call globalization. Let me read the introduction to my book to set the stage for this sense of siege that I'm referring to. There will be a time when your religion will be like a hot piece of coal in the palm of your hands. You will not be able to hold it. The Prophet of Islam was gazing into the future while he talked to his followers early in the 7th century in Arabia. Would this mean that there would be very few Muslims? Someone asked later. No, replied the Prophet. There will be larger numbers, more than ever before, but powerless like the foam on the ocean waves. After September 11, 2001, the prediction of the Prophet seemed to be coming true. Islam became as hot as a piece of coal for its followers. Yet it had more followers than ever before, and they were for the first time spread all over the globe. Muslim societies everywhere appeared to be in turmoil, and Muslims felt themselves in the dock, accused of belonging to a terrorist, a fanatic, and an extremist religion. It seemed Islam was under siege. Now, the element of societies being under siege demands that we begin our analysis of them in a more sophisticated way than has been done so far. And this is what I proposed. The answers in the media, and these were answers to the questions of why do they hate us? Why did they come and inflict so much murder and mayhem on September 11 here on our shores? The answers in the media were not only incomplete, they were pushing the debate in the wrong direction. Hate and prejudice substituted for thought and analysis. The social sciences could have provided answers. Yet, in all the discussion of suicide attacks, I did not once hear the name of Emil Durkheim, whose seminal work on suicide informs scholarly discussions. Durkheim underlined that traditional explanations of suicide, such as mental disturbance, race, or climate, did not fully explain the act. He argued that suicide was a consequence of a disturbed social order. Moral codes were disrupted in times of change and affected rich and poor, he wrote. The strain led to suicide and abnormal behavior, which he identified as anormy, abnormal behavior. This is Emile Durkheim, the great French sociologist. And you'll pardon me for quoting a French sociologist, I think. We also moved out of that phase, I hope. In this book, I'm exploring alternative concepts to postmodernism, post-emotionalism, and post-human to explain our world. I suggest we are entering a post-honor world. I'm suggesting we explore the notion of honor and its use in our time as a tool with which to look at our world. We cannot do so without reference to society and its ideas of asabiya, group loyalty, cohesion, or solidarity. If the definition of honor is changed, then we need to examine society to understand why this has happened. I argue that it is a consequence of a new variety of asabiya, which is based in an exaggerated and even obsessive loyalty to the group, and which is usually expressed through hostility and often violence towards the other. I call this hyper-asabiya. I am pointing to cause and effect here. However, mine is merely an exploratory effort, suggesting possible future research. I will argue that the dangerously ambiguous notion of honor and the even more dangerous idea of the loss of honor propels men to violence. Simply put, global developments have robbed many people of honor. Rapid global changes are shaking the structures of traditional societies. Groups are forced to dislocate or live with or by other groups. In the process of dislocation, they have little patience with the problems of others. They develop intolerance and express it through anger. No society is immune. Even those societies that economists call developed fall back to notions of honor and revenge in times of crisis. My last lines of the book, and it's a long, complicated argument, but I really argue at the end of the book that the way forward has to be interfaith dialogue. And I don't mean this as a cliche. It has to be more than meetings between the like-minded. This dialogue must be seen, it must be visible, and it must happen again and again and again. So ordinary people in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, see rabbis and imams and priests and Muslims and Hindus and Christians talking to each other, embracing each other, and really able to communicate of a common humanity to each other. Because if this does not happen, this is my argument, we are really, all of us, in deep, deep trouble. So the last lines of the book, and please bear with me, it's coming to an end now. The last lines of the book are, the events of September 11 appeared to push the world toward the idea of the clash of civilizations. But they also conveyed the urgency of the call for dialogue. The creative participation in the dialogue of civilizations to find an internal balance between the needs and traditions of local communities and a world increasingly dominated by international corporations and political concerns. The committed search for global solutions to the common global problems confronting human society, and the quest for a just, compassionate, and peaceful order will be the challenge human civilization faces in the 21st century. To meet the challenge is to fulfill God's vision. To embrace all humanity in doing so is to know God's compassion. So the last word in this book is compassion. And we haven't seen much of compassion in the last couple of years. We really need to rediscover this particular word, which is at the root of all faith, of all understanding of the divine, compassion and tolerance. I've also suggested that we need to emphasize the personal in our dialogue. And in a literary environment like this, I want to refer to one of my favorite authors, E.M. Forster, the great novelist who in the 1920s wrote one of the greatest books of English literature called A Passage to India. Now, some of you will recall that A Passage to India was dedicated to Sir Ross Masood, who was an Indian Muslim. So here we have, at the time of the empire, where you had all the elements of race and imperialism and so on, a book, one of the great novels of English literature, being dedicated to an Indian. Here was this man reaching across the cultures, extending his hand. In a very small reciprocal gesture, I have dedicated my book to my friend Professor Lawrence Rosen of Princeton University, in the hope that this dialogue across the cultures will continue. And I have dedicated it by writing, as always, my wife Zeenat inspired me with her commitment to my work, oversaw the writing of the book, and helped me in refining my ideas. The book is dedicated to our friend, Professor Lawrence Rosen of Princeton University, in acknowledgement of his scholarship and friendship. And I hope that this little gesture will help the dialogue that I'm here to talk of this evening. So I'm grateful that you're here this evening, and I'd be delighted to take any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Remember that we need you to line up at the mic to ask a question. While you're lining up, I'm going to ask a question, and that is, Bipsy Sawa, I'm not pronouncing, the Pakistani novelist,
Bapsi Sidhwa,
Sidhwa, had a glowing review of this book in the Pakistani publication called Dawn. And my curiosity was, is that possible to write like that without retribution in Pakistan?
Barbara's asked a very interesting question because Bapsi Sidhwa is one of the most famous novelists produced from South Asia. Her books have been made into feature films, Hollywood films. But she's right, Barbara's right, because Bapsi told me that every time she writes, some people ring up and some people say, you have no right to be talking about Islam because you're not a Muslim. She, in fact, is a Parsi, not a Muslim. But she's a great novelist, and I don't know her, I haven't even met her, but I'm very grateful that she has written this excellent supporting review of the book. And I indeed am very grateful to her because I respect her work immensely and respect her great talent in literature.
I wonder if you would give your views about...
Could you please introduce yourself?
David McMeans. I wonder if you would... is not on yet? Is that better? Okay, David McMeans. I wonder if you would give us your views about some of the specific reasons for 9/11. It's still not there? I thought it was. Well, we'll try again.
Now you're loud and clear,
yes. David McMeans is my name. I wonder if you would give us your views as to the specific reasons for 9/11.
David, the short answer is you got to read my book. Very briefly, I think that there's a lot going on in the Muslim world and not in the last couple of years. We tend to blame everything on the process of globalization, but I have analyzed that there have been, over the last decades, certain developments taking place in global societies which are causing great upheavals, disintegration, uncertainty to take place. This is causing a great deal of resentment. And rightly or wrongly, I don't want to go into the politics of it, but a lot of this is then focused on the United States of America. I've given the analogy of the village. If it is a global village we're living in, then the United States of America is that rich quarter of the village, which sort of lords it over the rest of the village. In terms of income per capita, wealth, consumption, all the figures, in terms of population, if 6% of the population of the world is from the United States, then the wealth would be 60-70%, in political influence maybe even more. And that causes a lot of resentment, not only in the Muslim world. Now combine this with the fact that in the Muslim world, you have a crisis of leadership, you have a crisis of education, you have a crisis of class, which means the gap between the rich and the poor is growing alarmingly wide. And you are really, in a sense, you have the stage set for September 11. And on top of all this, you have the absence of people who are propagating or talking about or hammering home the message of compassion and tolerance. This has to happen, because if it doesn't happen, then what we're going to see is turmoil, turmoil, and turmoil.
Good evening. My name is Nassim Rubin, and I am an Indian Jew from India. And what Dr. Ahmed was talking about, interfaith dialogue, although what you might hear from the media, in South Asia, we still have examples of how communities, minorities live together. In India, all Jewish synagogues in Bombay, Pune, Ahmedabad, Delhi are located in Muslim neighborhoods and Muslim areas, and we had great relationship with them for centuries. Now, taking that and bringing it here, that culture here to the United States, I pleasantly came across Dr. Ahmed, and I have asked him to be my guide and to work under him as an RA.
See, you'll get me into trouble with my friend, the rabbis. They're going to say that you've taken away one of ours.
But I just want to give an example of what we would like to continue. I was glad to see Mr. Javed Sultan here, with Dr. Ahmed. I was in Boston at the ADL-sponsored seminar on interfaith dialogue. Now, I feel that the time is very ripe to show that South Asia, despite all its difficulties, can lead in this interfaith dialogue. And third is, I would like to congratulate you. You're the first Islamic scholar to name your book after a Jewish friend. So, thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Nassim. You're absolutely right, Nassim, and this is something I believe that we could share with our American friends. We have this to contribute to them, bring to them here to America, because the American experience with South Asia is more limited than, say, the British or the French, and understandably, because they were there as imperial powers. And what is often missed is that in the conflict and confrontation that takes place between India and Pakistan, and therefore obscures all other facts, is the deep synthesis, the deep appreciation of other cultures that existed in the subcontinent for centuries and centuries and centuries. And Nassim gave me a remarkable example, because in America it is assumed, it is a given, that the Jewish and the Muslim communities cannot get on with each other. And it is understandable, because very often people see the Middle East and see this hopeless situation, this cycle of violence, the hopeless cycle of violence, and they then impose that upon the situation here in America, and they say, these are two communities that cannot get on with each other. And yet Nassim gave us this great example of hope. Even I didn't know this, but he said that all the synagogues in the subcontinent are actually consciously and deliberately built in Muslim areas, because they feel safer there, and they feel these are basically Abrahamic peoples. We are people of the book. We are the same cultural, theological tradition in the main, and we have much that is common. So again, these are facts, and these are, I believe, cultural factors that we can bring to the table, to America, to this rich culture here, and add to the understanding of cultures here.
My name is Leo Welt. First, I would like to congratulate you on such a fine discussion. And most people really share your aspiration. You have such a beautiful book, the Quran. And within the Quran, there is a phrase, and I've been puzzled by it. Find the infidel, seek him out, and kill him. Why hasn't something like this been repudiated, and what is your thinking about it?
Leo, good question, and I knew you'd ask it, so I had it in my book. It is in the book. The problem is that no one reads the next line. The first line is, and every Muslim is clearly told to stand up and defend his family and his people. There is no turning the other cheek, because it is more realistic. If your wife or your children or your parents are being attacked, you must defend them. That is compulsory on you. The next line goes on to say, however, if they want peace, then seek peace with them, because God prefers peace. And that is important, Leo, because what the critics of Islam do is to take that particular line out of context. And what those people who advocate violence within Islam do is they also take that line out of context. So if there's a leader who wants to preach violence, he will take, a Muslim leader, he will take that particular line. A similar example refers to the women, the business of marriage. Now the first line of the Quran, and I've had to study this, and I may share that I don't have 4 wives. I've got one lovely wife. I'm very happy with her. We've been married for decades and decades, and I have no intention of getting anyone else beyond her. But the first line goes on to say, you may marry 1, 2, 3, 4. And there's almost a ... God is saying, all right, in certain circumstances, there's war, all the men have been wiped out, so rather than do other things that you should not be doing, take women as lawful wives and respect them. However, this is the second line, God goes on to say, you cannot treat them as equals. And as you cannot treat them as equals, you must not have more than one wife. So, in effect, God is saying the best marriage is between one man and one wife, except in the most extraordinary circumstances. Once again, people take the first line out of context. So you get a man happily married to 4 wives, if any man can be happily married to 4 wives. And he will say, well, the Quran tells me to do so. And you ask him, brother, what about the second line? And he'll look puzzled. He'll say, Leo, you've been reading Ahmed. Thank you.
My name is Brian Forrest. I'm a professor in the School of Public Affairs at American University, and I would like to let all of you know that it is a deep privilege to have Professor Ahmed as my colleague. My question is directed to popular media. We live in a sea of information that is shaped by people who have little interest in the kind of quiet collaboration that you promote and that I think we all promote. What can be done about a media the world over that seems to be far more interested in clash and conflict than in things that are boring that you are speaking of?
Brian, I'm delighted and of course honored that you're here. We recognize you as one of our very eminent colleagues on campus, so I'm delighted and honored you're here. This is a big problem because, as I told you, I feel very frustrated. I feel talked down to. I feel humiliated when I sit and hear the discussion for people who have very little idea about my culture, about my religion, talking about my religion and my culture. And I just say that these people would benefit by talking to the experts. And you know, on American University campus, there's such extraordinary figures you have, who scholars and writers and authors. We have some of them in the audience. I know Ambassador Clovis Maqsood is sitting over there. He's one of the very well-known distinguished figures. Professor Levinson over there at the back. Now, these are figures who can contribute to the media. I don't think that they are called upon as much as they should be called upon. And this is a challenge, Brian. We have to somehow communicate this to the media, that it is, I really feel that in this environment, and if we accept the thesis that there is a world crisis that is approaching us, that in this environment, if the media are not responsible, then we all have to pay for it. And how we have to pay for it, you connect the dots. Because what is being said here, in perhaps innocence or perhaps out of ignorance, is having an impact out there in the Muslim world, where the Muslim world is beginning to form the impression that the war against terror or the war on terror is in fact a war against Islam. This impression is beginning to mount, and it's beginning to mount because a lot of ordinary, decent, good Americans are simply allowing this impression to continue through the media. So we have a conundrum, and a very, very difficult conundrum to crack. And really it is people like you, the academics, the writers, who have to be much more vigorous. It's no longer, I believe, a question of just being on campus and, you know, the ivory tower approach, which fortunately we don't have at American University. But that ivory tower approach is no longer an option with us. We have to be engaged. Thank you. Thank you, Ran.
Dr. Ahmed, thank you for being such a powerful voice for this cause and to share with us your great scholarship and understanding. My name is Jan Duplain, and I actually am alum of American University, and I know that you speak all over the country, and I hope you will, that there will be more people hearing you on C-SPAN that will be inviting you more places to speak. My question or statement really has to do with the questions that you bring up about the lack of knowledge that we have on Islam and the very basic questions that we may be asking about women's roles and others. It seems to me we're talking education and understanding early on. And I'm wondering if in your speaking around the country, the education and schools, I'm not talking about college where you can take different religions. I'm talking about at an early age of us, particularly in the world that we're living in today, for us to learn early about different religions and to understand with the globalization. Have you seen or felt impact on this in your travels into the education, younger education, whether it be high school?
Jen, I found the young generation very encouraging.
Mm-hmm.
They are very positive. They are global citizens. And they give me a lot of hope. The young Americans, anyone 20 younger, my students, for instance, they uplift the soul. They don't have a prejudice. They come with open minds, and they say this in class. I start by asking them, "Why are you here in class?" I run a course called The World of Islam, and they'll say that I'm Jewish. I have very little idea. Or I'm Christian. I'm from the Midwest. I'd like to learn about Islam, and in a couple of weeks, I really find them wanting to grapple with the issues and wanting to come up with solutions. So there's a great demand out there. It has to be a two-way process.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't only Americans learning about Islam. Muslims also have to learn about Christianity and Judaism and what America stands for. America has certain great values, universal values, the notion of democracy, human rights, liberty. These are values we all respect and we all look up to. Now, these are values that have an echo in Islam. And this message must be two ways, which means it must also go to the Muslim community. And I know that there's not only myself, there's some very distinguished Muslims involved in this exercise. We are very active and we are very much involved in it. And we only pray that channels like C-SPAN pick up the message and allow this voice of dialogue to, as it were, be heard.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want it to triumph over other voices because we don't believe in triumph and battling and violence and so on, but we certainly want it to be heard. Mm-hmm. It's not heard enough in the media. Right. So in the media, what you get is simple projections of Muslims as terrorists, as fanatics, as extremists, and the dialogue breaks down. There is very little dialogue. Mm-hmm. For instance, we have here this evening the Imam from Baltimore. Imam, where's the Imam? Here he is. Now, the Imam from Baltimore is one of the Imams consulted by President Bush. He's called to the White House when the Imams are called to discuss Islam. And the Imam has Imam, would you like to recite some of the Quran so that our guests could appreciate its beauty? Please. Come along here, Imam. Jan, could we give some of your airtime to the Imam? As long as he doesn't pop the question, you've got to be very careful with these Imams.
I just wanted to make it clear that when you spoke about the issue of President Bush, that was in the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C. It's well, I'm going to recite verse number 13, chapter number 49. It's called the Al-Hujurat. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير. O people, we created you from a single pair of male and females, and we made you into nations and tribes, that you may know each other. Verily, the most honorable of you is the most pious and righteous, and God is well acquainted with everything you do. This is the verse comes to my mind.
Thank you. Now, here you have a beautiful verse recited by the Quran, and I'm an anthropologist, as I said. And I study the Quran as a Muslim. And I ask myself, here's God. God could have said, I am parochial. You Muslims are the best people in the world. Go and kill everyone else. But God is saying, I have created people into tribes and nations, different tribes and nations, different colors, different religions, so that you may know each other and through their diversity wonder at my creation and worship me with more fervor. I think it's a marvelous verse which simply reaffirms our common humanity, our differences, but our common humanity. So thank you very much, Imam. Thank you. Please.
My name is Anand Chandavarkar. I have two questions. The one is conceptual and philosophic, and the second is empirical. The keystone of your book is Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, which I have read only in the English translation by Charles Isavi, and I hope I am not misquoting him. But let's take the central doctrine of Asabiyya. How can you reconcile the doctrine of Asabiyya with the Islamic separation of the church and the state, deen and dwala? Similarly, Islam alone among all the religions has this distinction between Darul Islam and Bilad al-Kufr, or Darul Islam and Darul Harb, the lands of Islam and the lands of the non-Muslims. My second criticism of the Ibn Khaldun approach is it implies a philosophy of historical determinism, very much like Max Weber, Toynbee, or Karl Marx. History is essentially a non-linear phenomenon, and it is misleading to talk in terms of cycles. That is one. My second question is an empirical one. I notice in this book, as well as in all your writings, you concentrate a good deal on the alleged mistreatment of Muslims in non-Muslim countries. Invariably, there is a section with a long tirade against India, as there is in this book. But you have never answered the question. Have you tried to apply the doctrine of difficulty of maintaining Asabiyya in Muslim countries, and how Muslims treat non-Muslims in their countries?
Thank you. These are important questions, several questions. Very quickly, let me start with the last one. I don't agree at all with what you say about India. I was born in India. I have the highest respect for Indian culture. And Nassim Rubin, my friend, will bear to that. If you read my work, you will see that again and again I lament the loss of the harmony and cultural synthesis which existed at one stage in Indian history. At the same time, you also have the reality on the ground, which is of two countries, India and Pakistan, which have been to war 3 times, and now perhaps hovering on, hopefully at this moment, good relations, but if things deteriorate, a nuclear exchange. I cannot exonerate that, because the killing of millions of people on both sides will be, I think, a great human tragedy. In terms of your theoretical questions, yes, I agree that some political philosophers talk about Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb, but that is not a theological position. You must be very clear that is a political scientist perception of the world. It is the scientist view of the world that this area was the world of Islam and therefore the world of order, and beyond this, and we are talking really of 1,000 years back, beyond this was the world of harb or war. That was the perception. How can you maintain that today, where many Muslims living in Western societies may have much more harmony and much more integration and much more freedom than they may have in their own countries? And as far as pointing out the persecution of non-Muslims in Muslim societies, once again, you have read my book, that's a great compliment, or my works. Please read them a bit more carefully. I have pointed out again and again in Islam Today, for example, about the killing of the Christians. I have pointed out the killing of the suicide of the bishop. I have pointed this out because I know some of these people personally. I have pointed out the problems of the blasphemy law. I had an article in the Washington Post last summer. So we are trying. I obviously can't be at every point, at every place at the same time, but I am trying to point out that there is a need for Muslims themselves to be looking at their own societies far more critically than we do. My focus, of course, as an anthropologist is Muslim society. So that is, in a sense, if you like, my limitation. It's very difficult for an anthropologist to be examining even the next village. And I'm considered very bold in the sense that I'm really talking about Islam and Muslim societies. Now, if I also start talking about Hindu societies and Jewish societies and Buddhist societies, the anthropological association will drive me out. So I need to be very careful about that. We need to have some sense of discipline in analysis. As far as Ibn Khaldun is concerned, we have, of course, a great Egyptian scholar, a great Arab scholar sitting here, and he would be, I think, far more appropriate to comment on Ibn Khaldun's Asabiyya than myself. In his presence, I don't dare talk about Ibn Khaldun. Ambassador Clovis Maqsood, would you please come and grace us with an answer to the question of Ibn Khaldun?
First of all, I'm very privileged to be here tonight to listen to one of the most insightful analysis of Islam and the challenges that Islam is facing on the global scene. And I think that this is a major contribution to a more enlightened constituency on the global level. And I thank you. I wanted to just mention about the questions that you have raised, and I would like to share some of my assessments about it. First of all, when the question was asked, why do Arabs and Muslims hate us? I don't think that was a very pertinent question. I think that was not a pertinent question. The question is that very few lunatic fringes hate in every society, and we have them. But what many people in the Arab and Muslim world, as Professor Ahmed said, are angry with some of the aspects of policies, with others. Anger is an invitation for dialogue. And I think in that sense, what you're doing is to translate anger as an opportunity for dialogue. While hate is a deliberate rupture with any kind of dialogue. It has the cult of death, and that is why it's suicidal at times. And that is one aspect that I would like to comment on. And we have many reasons. Arabs and Muslims have many reasons to be angry. It is important that that anger must be managed through dialogue. The other thing is many Muslims and Arabs, because of the asymmetry of power, can handle being humbled, but they cannot handle being humiliated. And it is therefore the language, the discourse, that is important. One aspect of the discourse is that please don't talk at us, talk to us. I mean, that is a very crucial aspect in dialogue. Many people pontificate over us, and then we become paranoid and we react by talking back at. And in the asymmetry of power, talking back is useless. The third thing is the notion which Ibn Khaldun, and I think this is important in the contemporary world, that there is a prevailing notion that Islam and secularism are not compatible. That is not a true description, despite the fact that society and state are sort of blended in Islam. What is the basic issue? Is that secularism is the separation not of state from religion itself, because, well, let us say in any Muslim society, 99.99% are Muslims. They might not be very devout, they might not be very practicing, they might not be very fanatic, but nobody would deny that they are Muslim. And so the state is the sum total and the resultant of the interaction of its citizens, and therefore there is no separation between the state and religion. What there is a separation is that the point of reference, that Islamic institutions should not be the point of reference for political decision making. That exists. However, the distortion in language is that Islam and secularism don't coexist with each other. If we translate that, it is that if the parish bishop or an imam considers that what he says is a political direction, then you have the blending. But in the Islam and the Islamic, there is a whole tradition of secular evolution, but secularism not in the same Christian sense, because in Islam there is no church as such. And in that sense, I think the notion also of asabiyya. Asabiyya is not necessarily fanaticism of the tribe or fanaticism of a group. Asabiyya means the loyalty aspect of an identity. And that has been subject to a great deal of interpretation. And one of the major interpretations is that asabiyya is also how to hold yourself without being irrational. And therefore your identity should be protected not in contradiction to other identities, but in an assertive of the equality of your identity with others. In that respect, I don't want to take more of your time, but I must say that this is one of the most enlightening evenings that I have had during this period. And besides, he is my neighbor at the university, but he's a far more enlightened neighbor than me. Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum, Akbar Sahab. My name is Javed Sultan, and as I was coming to this lecture, I caught the tail end of a news in the CNN, and I apologize if I didn't get it exactly right. But one of the anchor person made a joke that, they just found out that you can actually divorce in Islam by through the internet, and they were joking about the fact whether you have to do it call it out 3 times or 1 time. And the other anchor woman in jest said, well, of course, do the women asked the question, do the women have a right in Islam to divorce? And the other anchor man laughed, and then she said, of course not. And of course that's false. People don't realize women do have the right to divorce in Islam. Correct me if I'm incorrect.
You're right,
sir.
absolutely right.
It's called khula. So my first question is gender discrimination. Could you please, sir, explain the socio-anthropological reasons for gender discrimination or gender biases? In Hinduism, for example, they commit sati. They still do commit sati, where they burn a woman alive when her husband dies, but it's not vice versa. So there are socio-anthropological, economic reasons why women were assigned certain roles and then subsequently developed into certain status which has been taken for granted. So, and another aspect, when people do jest like that on CNN, they subtly demonize Muslim men as being insensitive, as being inconsiderate, and that is perhaps a greater damage to do to Muslims in general.
Thank you, Javed. I think that's a very telling illustration of what we've been discussing, that very often, inadvertently, the media say things which are not only hurtful, but actually wrong. And this is an example of that. Women in Islam have many rights. In reality, they are not getting those rights for all kinds of reasons: ignorance, tribal society, rural society. But the fight is on. Women are very aware of this. In the Muslim world, there have been female prime ministers. Even now, there are female prime ministers, female presidents, females, governors, ambassadors playing a critical role. And the battle will carry on. And most women are aware that to succeed, for their societies to succeed, Muslim women must battle for their rights within their tradition and culture. And once again, the debate here in America can help the direction of the debate in the Muslim world.
We're we're beginning to run out of time, but I don't want to pass up the people who have been standing in line to ask a question. So what I'm going to ask the people who are in line to do is to state your question, and then after all have stated their question, I'm going to ask Dr. Ahmed if he can kind of pull out of what that he feels are the essential things to respond to for you. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Sharon Kim, and my question is, can you elaborate on your critique of prominent and popularized Western scholars like Samuel Huntington, who contend simplistically and portentously that we are headed towards a clash of civilizations?
Yeah, thank you.
My name is Michael Kara, Dr. Ahmed. This afternoon I was reading in the Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, 2001, statement by Valentine M. Moghadam. Although Islamist movements have suffered from and confronted authoritarian regimes, such as British, but I do have my American papers, no Islamist movement or theorist has offered a model of democratic governance, and I question our democracy today controlled by money and corporations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sally Rush. We all have enjoyed the experience of reading your wonderful books. We all agree that there should be more dialogue. What is actually being done? How can each of us help and promote dialogue?
My name is Charles Stevenson, and I'm an intercultural activist in this area. How can we best go about building community-based, grassroots-based networks, groups, whatever, to communicate within ourselves and to start sharing knowledge without the permission, as it were, of government and the media? Thank you.
Thank you. Very quickly, the first question was about Huntington. In fact, I have referred throughout this book to Huntington, or that position, in terms of the idea of the clash of civilizations. It's not only Huntington, there are many other people who feed into what Huntington says, and there is a very strong, powerful argument in what Huntington is saying. And to be fair to Huntington, it isn't that Huntington is advocating a clash of civilizations. He's simply analyzing it. This book, in a sense, takes the opposite view, that a dialogue is also taking place and needs to take place. In fact, Professor Brian Forrest and myself are editing a book called The Dialogue of Civilizations, which is going to be hopefully balancing the talk of the clash of civilizations. And we need to appreciate that the talk of dialogue came from President Khatami of Iran at the United Nations several years ago, when he introduced the idea of the dialogue of civilizations. A very important idea, we need to pick it up. The question that Michael raised about democracy and whether there's an Islamic theorist or man of action who talks of democracy, well, South Asia, 1920s, 1930s, Allama Iqbal, one of the greatest Muslim thinkers and philosophers, who talks of democracy, who talks of Islamic democracy. Mr. Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, who translates his ideas. They are both man of ideas, man of action, united in wanting a Muslim state, a Muslim polity, but one based in tolerance, in compassion, in ideas of acceptance. It didn't quite work in the way they had wanted to, but the idea is there. And the very achievement of the state in the creation of Pakistan in 1947 gives us hope that within Muslim culture, there is an indigenous, authentic model for dialogue. The last two questions, what we should do about this, this is the key question. I implore all of you, and through C-SPAN, I implore America to help in any way you can in dialogue. Simply that. Support it, fund it, give a room, give a platform, give a classroom, bring friends, and let Jews, Muslims, Christians, non-Abrahamic peoples, everyone be involved in this dialogue. Let us begin the process of understanding each other. We are living in a very rich culturally very rich society with great traditions. Let us contribute to it. And let us also be aware that there are very dangerous cracks opening up in this society. And I had given the example of the burning cross. So I don't want to end with that example. I want to end with the example of what the Prophet of Islam said about Jesus. He said that there is no one higher in regard for Jesus than I am. So for me as a Muslim, these are great stirring names and figures. Jesus or Moses, these are part of my tradition as a Muslim. So there is a great deal that is common between us. Let us explore this. Let us develop what is common between us. Let us not only emphasize what divides us. The example that my friend Javed from Boston just gave about these commentators glibly and sometimes ignorantly dismissing Muslim men, Muslim women, these are not only hurtful, but they're doing us a great deal of damage. All this is being seen in many parts of the Muslim world and is feeding into the anger, into the hatred, and some young man, some young soldier somewhere shot at purely because he happens to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. So let us connect the dots. The job of a professor on campus is to connect the dots. And that is ultimately all we can do. To take these ideas forward is the challenge that you face here this evening. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Once again, I want to thank Akbar Ahmed. I think that you understand after this evening of why he always has an open invitation to return. So thank you for coming, and we'll look forward to your next visit.
Akbar Ahmed is a professor of international studies at American University. Islam Under Siege is published jointly by Polity and Blackwell Publishing. Visit polity.co.uk for more information. Now another